Welcome to What If Sleepstorian, where What If whispers timeless tales into dreams. Breathe deeply, let your mind soften, and drift into tonight's gentle story. What if ancient shadows from the land of Pharaohs found their way to fog-wrapped London streets, where brilliant minds sought to unravel mysteries that time itself had buried in golden sand? So dim the lights, find your most comfortable position, and let these whispered narratives carry you softly towards sleep. The autumn rain fell like silk threads upon the cobblestones of London, each droplet catching the amber glow of gas lamps that lined Baker Street like a procession of gentle guardians. In this hour between day and night, when the city breathed softly and settled into evening's embrace, the very air seemed to hum with secrets waiting to be discovered. The fog rolled in from the Thames, soft and welcoming, wrapping around the familiar Georgian buildings like a cashmere shawl, transforming the bustling metropolis into something dreamlike and ethereal. From the tall windows of 221B Baker Street, warm golden light spilled onto the wet pavement below, creating pools of comfort in the gentle darkness. Inside, the sitting room glowed with the soft crackling of a coal fire, its flames dancing lazily in the hearth, casting shifting shadows that played across walls lined with books, scientific instruments, and the accumulated treasures of countless solved mysteries. The scent of pipe tobacco mingled with the aroma of Mrs. Hudson's evening tea, creating an atmosphere of scholarly comfort that seemed to exist outside of time itself. Sherlock Holmes sat in his favourite chair, the burgundy leather worn smooth by years of contemplation, his sharp grey eyes reflecting the firelight as he studied a peculiar letter that had arrived with the evening post. The paper felt strange beneath his fingers, thick, almost parchment-like, with an odd texture that spoke of distant places and ancient hands. The ink bore an unusual sheen, as if it contained particles of something more precious than mere carbon, and the scent that rose from the pages carried hints of frankincense and myrrh, of desert winds and temple stones warmed by countless centuries of sun. Dr. Watson sat nearby, his medical journal open on his lap, though his attention had been drawn away from his writing by the contemplative silence that had settled over his friend. The doctor's kind eyes, weathered by years of service in Afghanistan's harsh landscapes and softened by his naturally gentle nature, watched as Holmes turned the letter over in his long, elegant fingers, examining it with the focused intensity of a scholar deciphering an ancient text. The rain continued its gentle percussion against the windows, creating a rhythm that seemed to pulse with the very heartbeat of the city. Somewhere in the distance, Big Ben chimed the half-hour, its deep bronze voice rolling across London like a lullaby, while closer by, the soft clip-clop of horse hooves on wet stone spoke of hansoms making their way through the lamplit streets, carrying their passengers home to warm firesides and peaceful dreams. "Watson," Holmes murmured, his voice carrying that particular quality it took on when a puzzle had captured his imagination, soft yet intense, like the purr of a great cat contemplating its prey. "I believe we're about to embark upon an adventure that will take us far from these comfortable surroundings, into realms where the past refuses to remain buried and where ancient curses may prove to be more than mere superstition." The letter bore the seal of the British Museum, pressed into deep red wax that seemed to gleam with an inner fire. As Holmes broke the seal with careful reverence, the wax crumbled like dried blood, releasing another wave of that exotic fragrance that spoke of pyramid chambers and pharaohs' tombs. The handwriting within was precise yet urgent, penned by someone whose usual scholarly composure had been shaken by events beyond their academic understanding. Outside, London continued its gentle evening symphony. The fog thickened, wrapping the city in its protective embrace, while gas lamps glowed like warm amber stars along every street and square. The clip-clop of horses became more muffled, more distant, as if the very sounds of the city were being absorbed by the soft grey veil that transformed familiar buildings into mysterious silhouettes and turned every corner into a potential gateway to wonder. Dr. Mortimer Blackwood, the letter explained, was the museum's chief curator of Egyptian antiquities, a man whose life had been dedicated to preserving and understanding the treasures of the ancient world. For 30 years he had worked among sarcophagi and papyri, canopic jars and golden amulets, treating each artifact with reverence due to objects that had been touched by hands that turned to dust millennia before Christ walked the earth. His reputation was impeccable, his scholarship beyond question, and his devotion to his work legendary among his colleagues. Yet now, this pillar of academic respectability found himself writing to London's most famous consulting detective, his usually steady handwriting betraying the tremor of genuine fear. The acquisition of a particular artifact, he explained, had brought with it a series of misfortunes so persistent and so precisely targeted that he could no longer dismiss them as mere coincidence. The Black Pharaoh's ceremonial mask, recently purchased from a private collector's estate, seemed to cast a shadow of malevolence over everything it touched. Holmes rose from his chair with the fluid grace of a man whose body was as disciplined as his mind, moving to the window where he could look out over the fog-shrouded street. The gas lamps below created halos of warm light in the mist, each one a small beacon in the gentle darkness. He pressed his palm against the cool glass, feeling the vibration of raindrops that continued their soft percussion against the pane, and allowed his mind to wander over the details Blackwood had provided. The mask itself was a masterpiece of ancient craftsmanship, fashioned from obsidian so pure it seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Gold had been inlaid in intricate patterns that depicted the journey of the soul through the underworld, while precious stones, lapis lazuli, carnelian and turquoise, had been set in configurations that corresponded to star patterns visible in the Egyptian sky 3,000 years ago. The workmanship suggested royal origins, though no records existed of any pharaoh who had chosen black stone for his burial mass rather than the traditional gold. The first incident had occurred within hours of the mask's arrival at the museum. Professor Whitmore, a respected Egyptologist who had been examining the piece, had suddenly collapsed while making his initial assessment. The doctors could find nothing wrong with him, no fever, no sign of illness or injury. Yet he lay in a deep, unnatural sleep from which no amount of calling his name or gentle shaking could rouse him. His breathing remained steady, his pulse strong, but his eyes moved constantly beneath closed lids, as if he were witnessing scenes of great distress in his dreams. Watson, who had been listening to Holmes's quiet recounting of the letter's contents, felt a familiar stirring of professional curiosity mixed with human concern. As a physician, he had encountered many mysteries of the human body, conditions that defied easy explanation and challenged the limits of medical knowledge. Yet something about this case seemed to reach beyond the natural world into realms where science and superstition blurred like objects viewed through morning mist. The fire in the grate settled with a soft whisper, sending up a small shower of sparks that glowed briefly like tiny stars before fading into nothing. The coal shifted and sighed, releasing the sweet scent of burning carbon that mixed with the lingering aroma of tobacco and tea, creating an atmosphere of profound comfort and safety that stood in stark contrast to the mysterious events unfolding in the letter's pages. Holmes continued reading, his voice taking on the cadence of a scholar reciting an ancient text. The second incident involved Mrs. Pemberton, the museum's head librarian, a woman whose dedication to preserving historical documents was matched only by her practical, no-nonsense approach to life. She had been cataloguing the papers that accompanied the mask's acquisition when she began speaking in what witnesses described as an unknown language, not gibberish or the confused rambling of illness, but fluent, coherent speech in what sounded like a sophisticated ancient tongue. The words flowed from her lips with a musical quality that seemed to resonate in the very stones of the museum walls. Professor Blackwood, whose knowledge of ancient languages was extensive, recognized certain phonetic patterns that suggested early Egyptian, but much of what she spoke remained incomprehensible. More disturbing still was the expression on her face as she spoke, a look of profound sorrow and desperate warning, as if she were trying to communicate something of vital importance, but was trapped behind a barrier of time and language. By the third day, the pattern had become impossible to ignore. Anyone who spent more than a few minutes in close proximity to the mask experienced some form of disturbance. The night watchman reported hearing the sound of chanting echoing through the Egyptian wing during his midnight rounds, though investigation revealed no source for the voices. A cleaning woman claimed to have seen figures in ancient Egyptian dress moving through the corridors, their forms translucent as morning mist but solid enough to cast shadows on the walls. The rain against the window had softened to a gentle whisper, each droplet contributing to the symphony of evening sounds that surrounded 221B Baker Street like a lullaby. Somewhere in the building below, Mrs. Hudson could be heard moving about in her kitchen, the soft clink of china and the whisper of her footsteps creating a domestic melody that spoke of safety and routine, of a world where mysteries might be solved by reason and observation, rather than ancient curses and supernatural intervention. Watson set aside his journal, his medical mind automatically cataloguing the symptoms described in Blackwood's letter while his imagination conjured images of museum corridors filled with shadows that moved independently of their sources. He had seen enough of the world's mysteries during his time with Holmes to know that what seemed impossible often proved merely improbable, and that the line between science and the supernatural was far thinner than most people supposed. Holmes turned from the window, his silhouette briefly framed against the amber glow of the street lamps before he moved back toward the fire. The flickering light caught the sharp planes of his face, highlighting the intensity of his grey eyes and the slight smile that played at the corners of his mouth, the expression he wore when a particularly intriguing puzzle had captured his attention. He folded the letter carefully, treating it with the same reverence one might show to an ancient manuscript, and placed it on the mantelpiece where the firelight could catch the red of its broken seal. "The letter concludes with an invitation," Holmes said, his voice carrying a note of anticipation that Watson recognised from their previous adventures. "Dr. Blackwood requests our immediate assistance, and has arranged for us to examine the mask tomorrow evening, after the museum is closed to the public. He believes that whatever force has been awakened by the artefact's presence grows stronger with each passing day, and fears that unless action is taken soon, the disturbances may escalate beyond his ability to control or conceal them." The implications of Blackwood's request settled between them like a shared understanding. They had dealt with cases that challenged conventional explanations before. The strange affair of the Baskerville Hound, with its supernatural aspects that had ultimately yielded to rational explanation, and the peculiar matter of the disappearing regiment, which had led them into territories where folklore and fact intersected in ways that defied easy categorization. Outside, the fog continued to thicken, transforming London into a city of soft edges and mysterious distances. The gas lamps became halos of diffused light, each one a warm beacon in the gentle grey embrace that wrapped around buildings and streets alike. The sounds of the city, the distant rumble of omnibuses, the soft conversation of late pedestrians, the occasional call of a night vendor, all became muffled and dreamlike, as if the fog were not merely a meteorological phenomenon, but a gateway between the solid, rational world of gaslight and industry and the older, stranger realm of myth and legend. Watson rose from his chair and moved to stand beside his friend, both men gazing out at the transformed cityscape. The familiar streets of their neighbourhood had become something from a fairy tale, where every shadow might conceal a story, and every pool of lamplight might mark the beginning of an adventure. It was in moments like these that Watson understood most clearly why he had chosen to share his life with this extraordinary man, whose brilliant mind could find patterns in chaos and meaning in mystery. "What do you make of it, Holmes?" Watson asked, his voice soft with the comfortable intimacy of long friendship. "Do you believe there could be truth to these reports of supernatural manifestations?" Holmes was quiet for a long moment, his sharp profile silhouetted against the window as he considered the question. When he spoke, his voice carried the measured tone of a man who had learned to suspend judgment until all evidence had been examined, yet who remained open to possibilities that others might dismiss out of hand. "I have learned, my dear Watson, that the universe contains wonders that our current understanding cannot fully encompass," he said finally. "Whether the phenomena surrounding this mask represent supernatural forces or merely the operation of natural laws we have yet to comprehend remains to be determined. What is certain is that something has disturbed the equilibrium of an institution known for its scholarly calm, and that disturbance appears to centre on an artefact whose origins are shrouded in mystery. The fire settled in the grate with a soft whisper, sending up another small shower of golden sparks that danced briefly in the warm air before fading. The light painted shifting patterns on the walls, creating an ever-changing tapestry of shadow and illumination that seemed to echo the fluid nature of the mystery they were about to investigate. In the gentle glow, the familiar objects of their sitting room, the books and instruments, the papers and pipes, took on an almost magical quality, as if they too were artefacts from a time when the boundaries between the known and unknown were more fluid than the modern world allowed. Watson found himself thinking of his service in Afghanistan, of nights spent under alien stars in a landscape that seemed to belong more to legend than to the maps of the British Empire. He had learned in those distant places that the world was far larger and stranger than the comfortable assumptions of Victorian England might suggest, and that wisdom often lay in approaching the unknown with both scientific scepticism and genuine humility. The clock on the mantelpiece chimed the hour with a voice like distant temple bells, its bronze tone resonating through the room before fading into the gentle symphony of evening sounds. Time seemed to flow differently here in their sanctuary above Baker Street, measured not by the mechanical precision of chronometers, but by the deeper rhythms of thought and contemplation, of friendship and shared purpose. Holmes moved away from the window, settling back into his chair with the fluid grace that characterized all his movements. He reached for his pipe, filling it with the deliberate care of a ritual performed countless times before, each action smooth and precise. The tobacco glowed as he applied a match, releasing its familiar fragrance into the air where it mingled with the scent of coal smoke and the lingering traces of that exotic perfume that still clung to Blackwood's letter. "Tomorrow evening, then," Holmes murmured, his words emerging with small puffs of aromatic smoke. "We shall pay a visit to the British Museum and make the acquaintance of this Black Pharaoh's mask. Until then, I suggest we prepare ourselves for the possibility that this case may take us into territories where conventional investigative methods may prove insufficient." Watson nodded, settling back into his own chair with the comfortable certainty that another adventure was about to begin. The rain continued its gentle percussion against the windows, while outside London settled into its evening embrace of fog and lamplight, shadow and mystery. In the warm glow of their sitting room, surrounded by the accumulated treasures of a dozen solved cases, they sat in companionable silence as the night deepened around them. The hours passed like pages turning in a familiar book, marked by the soft chiming of the clock and the gradual settling of the fire into glowing embers. Watson eventually dozed in his chair, his medical journal sliding from his lap as sleep claimed him, while Holmes remained awake, his mind already beginning to weave theories and possibilities around the strange events at the museum. The fog outside thickened until the street lamps became merely suggestions of light, in the grey embrace that wrapped around the city like a protective spell. When morning came, it arrived softly, the fog gradually lightening from deep grey to silver to the pale gold of dawn. The rain had stopped during the night, leaving the streets washed clean and gleaming under a sky that promised a day of gentle autumn sunshine. Mrs. Hudson's voice could be heard in the distance, calling up the stairs with news of breakfast and fresh tea, while somewhere nearby a church bell chimed the hour with a voice like liquid bronze. Holmes had remained in his chair through the night, though whether sleeping or thinking, Watson could never tell. The great detective's ability to enter states of profound contemplation that resembled sleep while remaining alert to his surroundings was one of his many fascinating peculiarities. As Watson stirred and stretched, feeling the pleasant stiffness that came from sleeping in a chair, Holmes opened his eyes with the immediate alertness of a cat awakening from apparent slumber. "Good morning, Watson," he said, his voice carrying no trace of fatigue despite his night-long vigil. "I trust you slept well. We have a full day ahead of us if we are to be properly prepared for this evening's appointment with the mysterious Black Pharaoh. The morning light filtering through the windows painted everything in shades of gold and amber, transforming their familiar sitting room into something touched by magic. The fog had lifted enough to reveal the street below, where early pedestrians moved with the purposeful energy of a new day beginning. The gas lamps had been extinguished, no longer needed now that natural light had returned to illuminate the world, but their presence remained as silent sentinels ready to guide travellers through whatever darkness might come. Watson rose and moved to the window, breathing deeply of the fresh air that carried the scent of rain-washed stone and the green smell of Hyde Park's ancient trees. London in the early morning had a quality of renewal about it, as if the night's embrace of fog and mystery had cleansed the city and prepared it for whatever adventures the day might bring. "What preparations do you have in mind?" Watson asked, turning back to find Holmes already reaching for his dressing gown, his movements quick and decisive now that a plan had taken shape in his mind. "Research, my dear fellow," Holmes replied, his grey eyes bright with the anticipation of the intellectual challenge. "If we are to understand what we may encounter this evening, we must first learn everything we can about the historical and cultural context surrounding this artefact. The British Museum's own library should provide us with excellent resources, and I suspect that Dr. Blackwood himself may prove a valuable source of information about the mask's provenance and the circumstances of its acquisition." The prospect of spending the day in scholarly research appealed to both men, each for his own reasons. Holmes delighted in the process of gathering and analysing information, in the gradual construction of understanding from seemingly unrelated facts and observations. Watson found satisfaction in the methodical approach to problem-solving that characterised their best investigations, the careful building of a knowledge that preceded decisive action. As they prepared for the day ahead, the sounds of London awakening continued to filter through their windows, the clip-clop of horses pulling delivery wagons, the distant whistle of an early train, the soft conversation of servants beginning their daily rounds. The city was returning to its familiar rhythms, yet beneath the surface of routine activities, Watson could sense the presence of mystery waiting to be unravelled. Mrs. Hudson appeared with their breakfast, her kind face glowing with the satisfaction of a woman who took pride in caring for her unusual tenants. The aroma of fresh bread and strong tea filled the air, while bacon sizzled gently in the pan she carried, its savoury scent mingling with the morning light to create an atmosphere of domestic comfort that seemed to anchor them to the solid, reliable world of everyday existence. "Will you gentlemen be dining at home this evening?" she asked, setting the tray on the table with practised efficiency. "Only I was planning to visit my sister in Hampstead, but if you'll be needing anything special—" "We shall be dining out this evening, Mrs. Hudson," Holmes replied with a gentle smile, "but I'm certain we shall return safely to enjoy your excellent breakfast tomorrow morning." Her face brightened with relief and pleasure, and she bustled about the room for a few moments more, adjusting curtains and straightening papers with the unconscious care of someone who had made their life's work the creation of comfort and order. When she finally departed, her footsteps could be heard retreating down the stairs, followed by the soft closing of a door and the resumption of her morning activities in the kitchen below. Watson poured tea for both of them, the china cups making soft chiming sounds as they met their saucers, while Holmes spread marmalade on toast with the precise attention he brought to all his activities. The simple ritual of sharing breakfast took on an almost ceremonial quality, a peaceful moment of normality before they ventured forth into whatever mysteries awaited them. The fog outside continued to lift, revealing more of London's familiar landscape with each passing moment. The street below became clearer, showing the wet cobblestones gleaming like dark mirrors and the plane trees lining the sidewalk beginning to show the first gold touches of autumn on their leaves. Somewhere in the distance, Big Ben chimed the quarter hour, its bronze voice carrying across the awakening city like a blessing. As they finished their meal, Holmes reached for the morning papers, his eyes scanning the headlines with the rapid, comprehensive attention he brought to all information gathering. Watson watched his friend's face for signs of particular interest, knowing that Holmes had an almost supernatural ability to detect patterns and connections that others might miss entirely. "Curious," Holmes murmured, his finger tracing a small item buried deep in the Times's inside pages. Here is a brief mention of unusual disturbances at several London museums over the past month. The Natural History Museum reports damage to display cases that cannot be explained by any known cause, while the Victoria and Albert Museum has had to increase security due to a series of what they term atmospheric disturbances in their ancient artefacts wing. Watson leaned forward, his interest sharpening as the implications of this information became clear. If the phenomena at the British Museum were part of a larger pattern, then the case might prove even more complex than Blackwood's letter had suggested. The possibility that multiple institutions were being affected by similar mysterious forces opened up new avenues of investigation and raised questions about whether the Black Pharaoh's mask was truly the source of the disturbances or merely the latest manifestation of something larger and more far-reaching. "Do you think there might be a connection?" Watson asked, though he could already see the answer forming in Holmes's sharp grey eyes. "I think, my dear Watson, that we are dealing with something far more significant than a single cursed artifact," Holmes replied, setting the paper aside with the decisive movement of a man whose mind had seized upon a new possibility. The timing suggests a coordinated phenomenon, though whether the coordination is intentional or the result of some larger force acting upon multiple objects simultaneously remains to be determined. The morning light continued to strengthen, painting their sitting room in shades of gold and amber that seemed to promise a day of discovery and revelation. Outside, London had fully awakened, the sounds of commerce and conversation filling the air as the great city went about its daily business. Yet for Holmes and Watson, the familiar world of gaslight and hansom cabs, of newspaper vendors and flower sellers, had already begun to recede into the background as their minds focused on the mystery that lay ahead. Holmes rose from the breakfast table with the fluid grace that characterized all his movements, already reaching for his coat and hat with the purposeful energy of a man whose course of action had been decided. Watson followed suit, checking that his medical bag contained everything he might need for whatever the day might bring, while his mind turned over the various possibilities that Holmes's observations had raised. The streets of London welcomed them with their familiar symphony of sounds and scents, the clip-clop of horses on cobblestone mixing with the calls of vendors and the distant rumble of omnibuses to create the urban melody that both men knew by heart. The fog had lifted enough to reveal the city in all its Victorian splendour, the grand buildings and busy thoroughfares that represented the heart of the world's greatest empire. Yet underneath the surface of prosperity and progress lay currents of mystery that spoke to older, deeper truths about the nature of reality itself. Their destination lay through the heart of Bloomsbury, where the British Museum stood like a temple to human knowledge and achievement. The great building's classical facade had watched over London for nearly a century, its columns and pediments speaking of humanity's eternal quest to understand and preserve the treasures of the past. Behind its stone walls lay collections that spanned the globe and the centuries, artifacts that had been touched by hands that turned to dust millennia before Christ walked the earth. As they made their way through the busy streets, Watson found himself thinking about the nature of curses and the power that ancient objects might hold over the modern world. His medical training inclined him toward rational explanations for phenomena that others might attribute to supernatural causes, yet his experiences with Holmes had taught him that the universe contained mysteries that current scientific understanding could not fully encompass. The morning air carried the scent of coal smoke and horse droppings, of fresh bread from nearby bakeries and the green smell of plane trees lining the streets. London in autumn had a particular quality that spoke to the soul, a sense of continuity and endurance that connected the present moment to the long chain of history that stretched back through the centuries to times when the sites now occupied by bustling streets and grand buildings had been forests and meadows beside a young Thames. Holmes walked with the easy confidence of a man completely at home in the urban landscape, his sharp eyes taking in details that others might miss, while his mind remained focused on the investigation ahead. Watson knew that his friend was already beginning to construct theories about what they might encounter at the museum, building hypotheses from the limited information available while remaining ready to abandon them in favour of new explanations as additional evidence emerged. The British Museum announced itself from several blocks away, its great dome rising above the surrounding buildings like a promise of knowledge and discovery. As they drew closer, the classical architecture became more impressive, the massive columns and carved pediments speaking of an institution devoted to the highest aspirations of human civilization. Yet something about the building's aspect this morning seemed different, as if the familiar landmark had acquired a subtle aura of unease that reflected the mysterious events unfolding within its walls. They paused at the main entrance, looking up at the inscription that proclaimed the building's dedication to the advancement of learning and the preservation of human achievement. The words seemed to carry additional weight this morning, as if the noble ideals they expressed were being tested by forces that challenged the very foundations of rational inquiry. Dr. Blackwood met them in the museum's grand entrance hall, his appearance immediately confirming the distress that had been evident in his letter. The curator was a man of perhaps 50 years, with the scholarly bearing and careful dress that marked him as a member of the academic establishment. Yet his usual composure had been shaken by recent events. His hands trembled slightly as he greeted them, and his eyes carried the haunted look of someone who had witnessed phenomena that challenged his fundamental understanding of the world. The entrance hall around them soared toward a ceiling decorated with classical motifs, while marble columns supported galleries that stretched away into the museum's various wings. The space had been designed to inspire awe and reverence for the accumulated treasures of human civilization, yet this morning it seemed to carry an undercurrent of tension that made visitors speak in hushed whispers and glance nervously at the shadows between the columns. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," Blackwood said, his voice carrying a note of relief that suggested he had been waiting for their arrival with considerable anxiety. "Thank you for coming so promptly. I must confess that the situation has continued to deteriorate since I wrote to you yesterday evening. Professor Whitmore remains in his unnatural sleep, and Mrs. Pemberton has begun speaking in what appears to be multiple ancient languages, sometimes simultaneously." Holmes's sharp grey eyes swept the entrance hall, taking in details of architecture and atmosphere with the comprehensive attention he brought to all new environments. Watson found himself automatically cataloguing the various exits and gathering points, a habit developed during his military service that had proven useful during their more dangerous investigations. The mask itself, Blackwood continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, seems to exert a stronger influence with each passing hour. Our night watchman reported that the chanting he hears during his rounds has become more distinct, more urgent, as if whatever forces surround the artifact are growing impatient with some delay or obstacle. The implications of this information settled around them like a gathering storm, and Watson felt the familiar mixture of excitement and apprehension that preceded their most challenging cases. They were clearly dealing with phenomena that lay outside the normal parameters of criminal investigation. Yet Holmes's reputation had been built on his ability to find rational explanations for apparently supernatural events. "I think it would be beneficial," Holmes said, his voice carrying the calm authority that Watson had heard in a dozen crisis situations, "if we could begin by examining the museum's records regarding the mask's acquisition. Understanding the artifact's history and provenance may provide clues to the nature of the disturbances it appears to be causing." Blackwood nodded eagerly, leading them through corridors lined with display cases containing treasures from around the world. Egyptian sarcophagi stood silent sentinel beside Greek statues and Roman mosaics, while medieval manuscripts and Oriental porcelain spoke of the vast sweep of human creativity across cultures and centuries. Yet as they moved deeper into the museum's Egyptian wing, Watson became aware of a subtle change in atmosphere, as if they were approaching the epicenter of some disturbance that affected the very air they breathed. The curator's office was a scholar's sanctuary, lined floor to ceiling with books and papers that represented decades of careful research into the mysteries of ancient Egypt. Hieroglyphic charts covered the walls alongside photographs of archaeological sites, while his desk bore the organized chaos of a mind that dealt simultaneously with multiple complex projects. Yet even here, in this bastion of scholarly rationality, Watson could sense an undercurrent of unease that spoke to forces beyond normal academic concern. Blackwood moved to a filing cabinet with the nervous energy of a man whose usual methodical habits had been disrupted by extraordinary circumstances. He withdrew a thick folder, marked with official seals and stamps that spoke of the complex international negotiations that often surrounded the acquisition of significant archaeological artefacts. "The mask came to us through the estate of Lord Pembroke," he explained, spreading papers across his desk with hands that still carried a slight tremor. His lordship had acquired it during his travels in Egypt some 20 years ago, though the exact circumstances of that acquisition remain somewhat unclear. The documentation suggests that it was discovered in a previously unknown tomb in the Valley of the Kings, though no official record of such a discovery exists in the Egyptian authorities' files. Holmes leaned forward, his sharp features intent as he studied the document spread before them. Watson recognised the expression his friend wore when examining evidence, a look of focused concentration that seemed to absorb every detail while simultaneously considering the larger patterns and implications that others might miss. The papers told a story of shadowy transactions and questionable provenance that suggested the mask's journey from its ancient resting place to the British Museum had been neither straightforward nor entirely legal. Lord Pembroke had apparently paid a substantial sum to a private dealer whose own sources remained conveniently vague, and the lack of proper archaeological documentation raised questions about whether the artefact had been legitimately excavated or simply looted from its tomb by treasure hunters. "What can you tell us about the mask's apparent age and cultural significance?" Watson asked, his practical mind seeking to establish the basic facts around which their investigation could be constructed. Blackwood consulted his notes, his scholarly training reasserting itself as he focused on the factual details of his specialty. "Based on stylistic analysis and the quality of the craftsmanship, we estimate the mask dates to approximately 1350 BCE, during the latter part of the 18th dynasty. However, several features are highly unusual for that period. The use of obsidian rather than gold for the primary material is unprecedented in known royal burial artefacts, and the astronomical patterns inlaid in precious stones correspond to star configurations that would have been visible from Egyptian latitudes at a much earlier date. The implications of this temporal discrepancy were significant, suggesting that the mask might represent either an artifact of extraordinary historical importance or a sophisticated forgery designed to confuse scholars and inflate its market value. Yet the phenomena that had begun manifesting since its arrival at the museum argued against any simple explanation of fraud or deception. Holmes picked up one of the photographs that documented the mask's arrival at the museum, studying it with the intense focus he brought to all visual evidence. The image showed a group of museum staff gathered around a wooden crate, their faces displaying the mixture of excitement and professional satisfaction that typically accompanied the acquisition of a significant new artifact. Yet something in their expression suggested that even then, before the mysterious disturbances had begun, there had been a sense of unease surrounding the object. "Were there any immediate effects when the mask was first unpacked?" Holmes asked, his grey eyes still fixed on the photograph, as if seeking to extract additional information from the captured moment. "Nothing that was recognised as unusual at the time," Blackwood replied, though his voice carried a note of uncertainty that suggested he was reconsidering events in light of subsequent developments. Professor Whitmore did mention feeling slightly dizzy while making his initial examination, but we attributed that to excitement and the late hour. Mrs. Pemberton complained of hearing what she described as whispers in the walls, but we assumed she was referring to the building's heating system, which does make various settling noises throughout the day. Watson found himself thinking about the progression of symptoms that Blackwood had described, noting the similarity to certain neurological conditions he had encountered during his medical practice. The gradual onset of auditory and visual disturbances, combined with altered states of consciousness, suggested the possibility of some form of environmental toxin or psychoactive compound that might be affecting those who spent time near the artifact. "Has anyone examined the mask for the presence of chemical residues or unusual materials that might explain these effects?" Watson asked, his medical training suggesting a line of inquiry that might provide a rational explanation for the mysterious phenomena. Blackwood shook his head, his expression showing both surprise and interest at the suggestion. "We have not conducted that type of analysis. Our focus has been on historical and artistic evaluation rather than chemical composition. However, that is certainly a line of investigation worth pursuing. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of footsteps in the corridor outside, followed by a soft knocking on the office door. Blackwood called for the visitor to enter, and a young woman in a dark dress and practical apron stepped into the room, her face pale with exhaustion and concern. "Begging your pardon, Doctor Blackwood," she said, her voice carrying a slight tremor that spoke of recent distress. "But Mrs. Pemberton has taken a turn for the worse. She's been speaking constantly for the past hour, and the words—" She paused, as if struggling to find an adequate description for what she'd witnessed. "The words seem to be affecting everyone who hears them. 2 of the guards have begun repeating phrases in the same strange language, and the cleaning staff refused to enter the Egyptian wing." The implications of this development were immediately clear to all present. Whatever force surrounded the Black Pharaoh's mask was apparently growing stronger and more far-reaching in its influence. The possibility that they were dealing with some form of contagious psychological effect raised the stakes considerably and suggested that immediate action might be necessary to prevent the situation from escalating beyond the museum's ability to contain it. Holmes rose from his chair with the decisive movement of a man whose course of action had crystallized in the face of an escalating crisis. His grey eyes held the sharp focus that Watson recognized from their most urgent cases, when time became a factor as important as evidence in determining the outcome of their investigation. "I believe," Holmes said, his voice carrying the calm authority that could steady nerves in the most chaotic circumstances, "that we should examine Mrs. Pemberton and the affected guards immediately. Understanding the precise nature of their condition may provide crucial insights into the mechanism by which the mask exerts its influence." They followed the young servant through corridors that seemed somehow different than they had appeared just minutes before. The familiar museum passages with their glass cases and carefully labelled displays had acquired an atmosphere of subtle wrongness that made Watson's medical instincts sharpen with alert caution. The air itself seemed thicker, carrying traces of that exotic fragrance they had first noticed in Blackwood's letter, frankincense and myrrh mixed with something else, something older and more primal that spoke of desert winds and ancient stones. The Egyptian wing stretched before them like a journey through time itself, lined with sarcophagi and statuary that had witnessed the rise and fall of dynasties, the construction of pyramids, and the slow march of centuries that had transformed a mighty civilization into museum displays. Yet this morning, the familiar artifacts seemed somehow more present, more alive, as if the boundary between past and present had begun to blur in ways that challenged the comfortable assumptions of the modern world. Mrs. Pemberton sat in the wing's main gallery, surrounded by towering statues of pharaohs and gods whose stone eyes had looked down upon the Nile when Rome was still a collection of villages on 7 hills. The librarian's usual practical demeanour had been completely transformed. She sat perfectly straight in her chair, her eyes closed but her face animated with expressions that shifted like clouds across a summer sky, now sorrowful, now urgent, now filled with a kind of desperate hope that seemed to reach across millennia. The words that flowed from her lips came in a steady stream, each syllable clear and distinct despite being in a language that had not been spoken as a living tongue for thousands of years. Yet somehow Watson found that he could almost understand the emotional content if not the literal meaning. Warnings mixed with lamentations, urgent messages that seemed to struggle against the barrier of time and translation to reach modern ears with their ancient wisdom. 2 museum guards stood nearby, their usual alert professionalism replaced by a vacant fascination, as they repeated phrases in the same archaic tongue. Their voices created a strange harmony with Mrs. Pemberton's monologue, as if they were participating in some ritual chorus that had been interrupted by centuries of silence and was now resuming its eternal refrain. Holmes approached the group with the careful attention of a scientist observing a delicate experiment, his sharp eyes taking in every detail of posture, expression and vocal pattern. Watson followed closely, his medical training automatically assessing the physical condition of the affected individuals, while his mind sought rational explanations for their extraordinary behaviour. "Fascinating," Holmes murmured. his voice barely above a whisper to avoid disturbing whatever process was unfolding before them. Notice how their breathing remains perfectly regular. Their pulse, if we judge by the visible signs, apparently normal. Yet they are clearly in an altered state of consciousness that allows access to linguistic knowledge they could not possibly possess through normal means. Dr. Blackwood joined them, his scholarly excitement warring with obvious concern for his colleagues' well-being. Mrs. Pemberton has been fluent in ancient Egyptian for over 2 hours now, he explained, his voice filled with wonder and worry in equal measure. Not just the formal hieroglyphic texts we know from temple inscriptions, but what appears to be the spoken vernacular of the common people, dialects and pronunciations that we can only guess at from our written sources. Watson moved closer to Mrs. Pemberton, his physician's instincts prompting him to check for signs of physical distress despite the apparent normalcy of her vital signs. As he approached, her words seemed to take on additional urgency, and her closed eyes turned toward him as if she could sense his presence despite her apparent unconsciousness. The stream of ancient Egyptian continued, but now Watson could detect what sounded like names and places woven into the linguistic tapestry, references that seemed to speak of betrayal and hidden knowledge, of sacred trusts violated and ancient warnings ignored. The emotional content was unmistakable, desperate attempts to communicate information of vital importance across the vast gulf that separated the living from the long dead. Holmes had moved to examine the guards, whose repetitive chanting provided a haunting counterpoint to Mrs. Pemberton's more complex discourse. Their faces wore expressions of deep concentration, as if they were struggling to remember something of crucial importance that hovered just beyond the reach of conscious thought. "How long have they been in this condition?" Holmes asked, his clinical tone masking the fascination Watson knew his friend felt when confronted with phenomena that challenged conventional understanding. "It began about an hour after Mrs. Pemberton started speaking," Blackwood replied. First one guard, then the other, began repeating fragments of her words. As time passed, their participation became more complex, more integrated with her discourse, as if they were gradually learning the language through some form of unconscious absorption. The implications were staggering. If the mask could somehow facilitate access to ancient knowledge and linguistic abilities, then they were dealing with forces that operated far beyond the normal parameters of human psychology. Yet Watson's medical experience suggested that extreme stress or certain neurological conditions could sometimes produce seemingly impossible feats of memory and linguistic ability. Holmes withdrew a small magnifying glass from his pocket and began examining the area around the affected individuals, searching for physical evidence that might explain their condition. His movements were precise and methodical, the familiar ritual of investigation providing a framework of rational inquiry within which to approach the apparently supernatural events. "The flooring shows no unusual markings," he observed, "and I detect no obvious sources of gas or chemical emissions that might account for hallucinogenic effects. Yet clearly something in this environment is facilitating these extraordinary manifestations." Watson found himself thinking about the power of suggestion and the documented cases of mass hysteria that have been recorded in medical literature. Yet the specificity of the linguistic knowledge being displayed, the consistency of the ancient Egyptian being spoken, argued against simple psychological explanations. Mrs. Pemberton's voice suddenly changed, taking on a different cadence and tone that suggested a shift in the identity or era of whoever was speaking through her. The new voice was deeper, more authoritative, carrying the unmistakable accent of command that spoke of royal blood and absolute power. "She's speaking as someone else now," Blackwood whispered, his eyes wide with scholarly excitement despite his obvious concern. "The linguistic patterns suggest Middle Kingdom Egyptian, perhaps 1,000 years earlier than the previous dialect, and the content—" He paused, listening intently to catch the meaning of the ancient words. "She's speaking of betrayal within the priesthood, of sacred knowledge stolen and misused by those sworn to protect it." The two guards began responding to this new voice, with what sounded like formal acknowledgements, their simple repetitions transforming into what appeared to be ritual responses in a liturgical dialogue that had not been heard since the pyramids were young. Holmes stepped back from his examination of the immediate area and began studying the larger context of the gallery, his sharp eyes taking in the arrangement of artefacts and displays that surrounded the affected individuals. Watson recognised the pattern of his friend's investigation, the systematic expansion of focus from specific details to broader patterns, seeking connections and relationships that others might miss. "Blackwood," Holmes said suddenly, his voice carrying the sharp note of discovery that Watson had learned to recognise as the moment when seemingly unrelated facts began forming coherent patterns in his friend's remarkable mind. "Where exactly is the Black Pharaoh's mask currently housed? I notice that Mrs. Pemberton and the guards are positioned almost in the centre of this gallery, yet I see no single artefact that would serve as an obvious focal point for their attention." The curator's face went pale as the implications of Holmes's question became clear. "The mask is in our restoration laboratory," he said, his voice tight with sudden understanding. 3 floors directly below this gallery. We moved it there for detailed examination, but if its influence can reach this far... The silence that followed this revelation carried the weight of realization that they were dealing with forces whose scope and power exceeded their initial estimates. If the mask could affect people at a distance of 3 floors, then the entire museum might already be within its sphere of influence. Watson felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air outside, thinking of the thousands of visitors who passed through the museum's halls each day, the hundreds of staff members who worked within its walls. The possibility that all of them might be vulnerable to whatever emanation surrounded the ancient artifact transformed their investigation from an interesting puzzle into a matter of urgent public safety. Mrs. Pemberton's voice shifted again, this time taking on the cadence of what sounded like a young woman speaking in urgent, frightened tones. The change was so dramatic that Watson instinctively stepped forward, his medical instincts responding to what sounded like genuine distress, even though he knew the librarian herself was unconscious and apparently unharmed. "She's younger now," Blackwood translated, his scholarly training allowing him to follow the rapid shifts in temporal perspective. Speaking of being forced to participate in rituals she doesn't understand, of being told that her sacrifice will ensure the protection of knowledge that must not be lost, there's terror in her voice, but also a kind of resigned nobility, as if she has accepted her fate for the greater good. The guards' responses had become more complex, their voices joining in what sounded like a ritual chant that seemed to provide comfort to the frightened young woman whose voice spoke through Mrs. Pemberton. The interplay between the different temporal perspectives was creating a form of historical drama that unfolded in real time, allowing the living to witness events that had taken place in the shadows of the pyramids millennia before Christ was born. Holmes had moved to examine one of the nearby display cases, his attention focused on a collection of canopic jars whose carved lids represented the 4 sons of Horus. Watson joined him, grateful for a moment to collect his thoughts away from the hypnotic pull of the ancient voices. "What are you thinking, Holmes?" Watson asked quietly, keeping his voice low to avoid disturbing whatever process was continuing behind them. "I am thinking," Holmes replied, his grey eyes reflecting the intensity of deep concentration, "that we are witnessing something far more significant than the random effects of a cursed artifact. The linguistic coherence, the historical accuracy, the emotional authenticity of what we are hearing suggests that we may be experiencing some form of actual communication with the past." The implications of this possibility were staggering, challenging fundamental assumptions about the nature of time, consciousness, and the boundaries between life and death. Yet Watson had learned to trust his friend's analytical abilities, even when they led into territories that conventional wisdom might dismiss as impossible. Mrs. Pemberton's voice changed once more, this time speaking with the measured tones of what sounded like a priest or scholar, delivering formal instruction. The guards responded with ritual acknowledgements, their voices creating a ceremonial atmosphere that seemed to transform the museum gallery into an ancient temple where sacred knowledge was being transmitted from one generation to the next. "The voice speaks of hidden chambers," Blackwood translated, his excitement evident despite his attempt to maintain scholarly objectivity. "Secret repositories where the most dangerous knowledge was sealed away from those who might misuse it. She's describing specific locations, architectural details that could actually help us identify actual archaeological sites. Holmes's attention sharpened immediately, his investigative instincts recognizing the potential significance of specific, verifiable information. If the voices speaking through Mrs. Pemberton could provide details that could be confirmed through archaeological research, then they would have evidence that transcended the subjective realm of spiritual phenomena and entered the objective world of historical fact. "Can you record these details?" Holmes asked, his practical mind already considering how such information might be verified and what implications successful verification might have for their understanding of the case. Blackwood nodded, producing a notebook and pencil with the automatic efficiency of a scholar accustomed to capturing important information whenever it appeared. His hand moved rapidly across the page, recording not just the content of the ancient instructions, but also notes about linguistic patterns and historical context that his expertise allowed him to recognize. The afternoon light filtering through the museum's tall windows had begun to take on the golden quality that spoke of evening's approach, painting the ancient artifacts in shades of amber and bronze that seemed to bring them alive with remembered warmth. Outside, London continued its daily rhythm of commerce and conversation, yet within the Egyptian wing, time seemed to flow according to different rules, connecting the present moment to an ancient past that refused to remain safely buried in history books. Watson found himself thinking about the nature of memory and the ways in which traumatic events might somehow imprint themselves upon objects and places, creating echoes that could persist across centuries. His medical training had exposed him to cases where patients exhibited knowledge they could not possibly possess through normal means, and he had learned to approach such phenomena with scientific curiosity rather than reflexive skepticism. The voices continued their ancient dialogue, weaving together perspectives from different eras and social positions to create a complex tapestry of historical experience. Through Mrs. Pemberton and the guards, they were witnessing the unfolding of events that had shaped the destiny of an entire civilization, told from the viewpoints of those who had lived through them, rather than from the detached perspective of modern historical analysis. Mrs. Pemberton's voice had taken on a new urgency, speaking rapidly in what sounded like instructions for protective rituals and emergency procedures. The guards responded with increasing animation, their ritual movements becoming more complex as they participated in what appeared to be preparations for some form of spiritual or technological crisis. "They're describing an invasion," Blackwood translated, his face pale with the implications of what he was hearing. "Foreign armies approaching the sacred sites, threatening to destroy or steal the repositories of ancient knowledge. The voices speak of desperate measures, of hiding the most important artifacts where they could never be found by those who would misuse them." The historical context was beginning to emerge with startling clarity. They were apparently witnessing the final days of some ancient Egyptian dynasty, when the guardians of sacred knowledge were forced to make desperate choices about how to preserve their civilization's most precious secrets. The mask itself might be one of those protective measures, a technological repository designed to safeguard crucial information until a time when it could be safely retrieved and understood. Holmes had begun pacing the gallery with the restless energy that characterized his most intense periods of analysis, his mind working to integrate the various streams of evidence into a coherent theoretical framework. Watson watched his friend's familiar process of investigation, knowing that each new piece of information was being evaluated against existing hypotheses and incorporated into an increasingly sophisticated understanding of their situation. The afternoon light had deepened to the rich gold of approaching evening, painting the ancient artifacts in warm hues that seemed to bring them alive with remembered glory. Outside, the sounds of London's rush toward evening could be heard faintly through the museum's thick walls, the clip-clop of horses, the rumble of omnibuses, the distant calls of vendors beginning their journey home. Yet within the Egyptian wing, time seemed to flow according to different rules, connecting the present moment to an ancient crisis that had shaped the destiny of an entire civilization. Mrs. Pemberton's voice suddenly changed to what sounded like formal pronouncements, her tone taking on the authority of royal decree. The guards responded with ritual acknowledgements that spoke of absolute loyalty and sacred duty. their voices joining in harmonies that seemed to resonate with the very stones of the museum walls. "She's speaking as a pharaoh now," Blackwood whispered, his scholarly excitement warring with obvious exhaustion from the strain of continuous translation, giving final instructions to the priesthood about the protection of sacred knowledge. "She's describing the creation of multiple repositories scattered across the empire to ensure that no single catastrophe could destroy everything." The strategic implications were impressive, suggesting that ancient Egyptian civilization had developed sophisticated contingency plans for preserving crucial knowledge in the face of existential threats. The mask they were investigating might be just one component of a vast network of information storage devices, each designed to activate under specific circumstances and provide access to different aspects of the preserved knowledge. Holmes stopped his pacing and turned to face the continuing manifestation with sharp attention, his grey eyes reflecting the intensity of sudden insight. "Blackwood," he said, his voice carrying the urgency of discovery, "has the museum acquired any other Egyptian artifacts recently? Particularly items that might have come from similar sources or time periods as the Black Pharaoh's mask?" The curator's face went pale as the implications of Holmes's question became clear. "The Whitmore collection," he said, his voice tight with sudden understanding. "Acquired just last month from the same estate. 14 pieces, including several items that our preliminary examination suggested might be companion pieces to the mask." The revelation that the museum housed multiple artifacts from the same source transformed their understanding of the situation completely. If the mask was designed to work in conjunction with other components, then its activation might be triggering responses from related devices throughout the collection. Watson felt a chill of premonition as he considered the implications of a coordinated activation of multiple ancient technological devices. If the phenomena they were witnessing represented just the beginning of a larger process, then the entire museum, and possibly the surrounding area of London, might be at risk from forces they were only beginning to understand. Mrs. Pemberton's voice shifted once more, this time speaking with what sounded like the warm tones of a mother addressing her children. The guards responded with voices that carried notes of affection and gratitude, creating an atmosphere of familial intimacy that contrasted sharply with the formal, ceremonial tone that had characterized much of their earlier dialogue. "She's speaking of love and sacrifice," Blackwood translated, his voice soft with emotion, "of the pain of separation and the hope that future generations will understand and appreciate the choices being made. There's a profound sadness in her words, but also a kind of transcendent peace that speaks of absolute faith in the righteousness of her cause." The human dimension of the ancient crisis was becoming increasingly clear, transforming abstract historical events into personal stories of love, loss, and sacrifice that resonated across the millennia. Through the voices speaking via Mrs. Pemberton and the guards, they were witnessing not just the preservation of technological information, but the preservation of human experience itself. Holmes had returned to examining the specific artifacts displayed in the gallery, his attention now focused on identifying any items that might be part of the Whitmore collection. His movements were quick and purposeful, driven by the growing urgency of their situation. "Here," he said suddenly, his voice sharp with discovery, "this canopic jar bears the same astronomical symbols as those described in the documentation about the mask, and this amulet, the craftsmanship and materials are virtually identical." Watson joined his friend in examining the identified artifacts, noting the subtle similarities in design and construction that spoke of common origins and unified purpose. If these items were indeed components of the same ancient system, then their presence in the gallery might explain why the manifestations were occurring here rather than in the restoration laboratory where the mask was housed. The voices continued their ancient dialogue, but now Watson could detect a growing sense of urgency in their tone, as if whatever process they were facilitating was approaching some form of climax or resolution. The guards' movements had become more complex, their ritual patterns creating intricate geometric shapes that seemed to mirror the astronomical alignments depicted in the surrounding artifacts. Dr. Blackwood had filled several pages with his rapid transcription, but his hand was beginning to shake with exhaustion from the mental strain of continuous translation. "They're describing the final activation sequence," he said, his voice tight with fatigue and anticipation. "The moment when all the protective systems come online and the repositories are sealed until the proper time for their reopening." The implications were staggering. If they were witnessing the ancient activation of protective systems that had been dormant for thousands of years, then their investigation had inadvertently triggered processes that were designed to safeguard knowledge and artifacts from unauthorized access. The question now was whether they would be recognized as legitimate inheritors of that ancient wisdom, or regarded as potential threats to be neutralized. Holmes's expression had taken on the sharp focus that Watson recognized from their most dangerous cases, when the stakes extended far beyond the immediate circumstances of their investigation. "I believe," he said quietly, his voice carrying the calm authority that could steady nerves in the most chaotic circumstances, "that we are about to witness the culmination of whatever process began when the mask was first brought into proximity with the other artifacts. The question is whether that culmination will bring revelation or catastrophe." The ancient voices had begun speaking in unison now, their separate streams of dialogue converging into a single powerful chorus that seemed to resonate through the very foundations of the museum. The words carried across the barriers of language and time to communicate meanings that transcended literal translation, warnings and blessings, instructions and farewells, all woven together into a final message from a civilization that had chosen to hide its greatest treasures in the shadows of eternity. Mrs. Pemberton's face had taken on an expression of transcendent peace, as if whatever force had been speaking through her was preparing to return to its ancient rest. The guards continued their ritual movements, but their gestures were becoming slower, more ceremonial, as if they too were participating in a final farewell to the distant past that had briefly touched their present moment. The golden light of evening had deepened to the rich amber of sunset, painting the gallery in hues that seemed to bridge the gap between ancient Egypt and Victorian London. Through the tall windows, the lights of the great city were beginning to twinkle like earthbound stars, while within the museum walls the artifacts of a vanished civilization prepared to return to their millennial silence. Holmes stood motionless in the centre of the gallery, his sharp grey eyes taking in every detail of the culminating manifestation with the comprehensive attention he brought to all moments of crucial revelation. Watson remained close beside his friend, ready to provide whatever assistance might be needed as they witnessed the conclusion of an ancient drama that had been interrupted by the rise and fall of empires. The voices spoke their final words in perfect harmony, their ancient Egyptian taking on a cadence that sounded like both blessing and farewell. Then, as gradually as morning mist dispersing before the rising sun, the manifestation began to fade. Mrs. Pemberton's voice grew softer, the guards' movements slower, until finally the gallery returned to the profound silence that had characterized it before the mysterious awakening began. Mrs. Pemberton opened her eyes with the slow, gentle awareness of someone awakening from deep, peaceful sleep. She looked around the gallery with mild confusion, as if trying to remember how she had come to be sitting in the chair, surrounded by concerned colleagues and distinguished visitors. "Oh my," she said softly, her voice carrying the slightly hoarse quality that follows extended speaking. "I seem to have had the most extraordinary dream. I was speaking with the most fascinating people about the most remarkable things, though I'm afraid I can't quite remember the details now." The guards similarly returned to normal consciousness, looking around with the bewildered expressions of men who had lost several hours without any clear memory of how the time had passed. Their professional training reasserted itself quickly, and they resumed their usual alert postures while clearly struggling to understand what had occurred during their period of altered awareness. Dr. Blackwood stood with his notebook still in hand, staring at the pages filled with his transcription of ancient Egyptian, as if he could hardly believe the evidence of his own careful documentation. The historical and linguistic information he had recorded represented a scholarly treasure of unprecedented value, yet the circumstances of its acquisition challenged every assumption about the nature of historical research and archaeological investigation. Holmes moved to examine the artifacts he had identified as components of the ancient system, noting that they now appeared somehow different, not in any way that could be precisely defined. but with a subtle sense of completion that suggested their long-dormant functions had been fulfilled. The astronomical symbols that had seemed so mysterious now appeared to glow with a soft inner light that spoke of activated purpose. Watson approached Mrs. Pemberton with his medical bag, his physician's instincts prompting him to ensure that her extended period of altered consciousness had not caused any physical harm. Her pulse was steady and strong, her breathing regular, and her eyes showed the clear focus of someone in perfect health despite the extraordinary experience she had undergone. "How do you feel, Mrs. Pemberton?" Watson asked gently, his professional manner designed to provide reassurance, while gathering information about her current condition. "Quite well, actually," she replied, her voice carrying a note of surprise at her own sense of vitality. "Rather refreshed, if truth be told, as if I had enjoyed the most restorative sleep, though I do have the strangest sense that I've been part of something quite important, even if I can't recall the specific details." The guards reported similar sensations, a feeling of having participated in meaningful activity, combined with a complete absence of specific memories about what that activity had entailed. Their professional composure had returned, but Watson could detect a subtle change in their bearing that spoke of men who had been touched by experiences that transcended their normal understanding of reality. Holmes gathered the group together in the centre of the gallery, his grey eyes reflecting the thoughtful satisfaction of a man whose investigation had yielded far more than anticipated. The late afternoon light streaming through the windows painted everything in shades of gold and amber that seemed to celebrate the successful conclusion of an ancient drama. "I believe," Holmes said, his voice carrying the warm tone he used when explaining complex matters to trusted colleagues, "that we have witnessed something unprecedented in the annals of historical research. The artifacts in this collection appear to have functioned as intended by their ancient creators, not as mere decorative objects or symbols of royal power, but as components of a sophisticated information storage and transmission system." The elegance of this explanation provided a framework for understanding the extraordinary events they had witnessed, while acknowledging their significance for both historical scholarship and human understanding of the relationship between past and present. The ancient Egyptians had apparently developed technology that could preserve not just objects and texts, but actual human experience across the vast gulf of centuries. Dr. Blackwood looked down at his notebook with something approaching awe, recognizing that the information he had recorded represented a scholarly treasure that could revolutionize understanding of ancient Egyptian civilization. Yet the circumstances of its acquisition raised profound questions about the methods and assumptions that had guided archaeological research for generations. "What happens now?" Blackwood asked, his voice carrying the mixture of excitement and uncertainty that characterized a scholar who had been granted access to knowledge beyond his wildest dreams, while simultaneously being forced to reconsider everything he thought he knew about his field of expertise. Holmes smiled with the quiet satisfaction of a man whose investigation had reached a satisfactory conclusion, his sharp features reflecting the warm light of the late afternoon sun. "Now," he said, "we ensure that this knowledge is preserved and studied with the care and reverence it deserves. The ancient guardians who created this system trusted that future generations would prove worthy of the wisdom they worked so hard to preserve. Our responsibility is to justify that trust. The implications of their discovery would undoubtedly reshape archaeological research and historical understanding for generations to come. Yet for the moment, in the golden light of the museum gallery surrounded by the silent testimony of ancient artifacts, there was a sense of profound completion that spoke to the successful bridging of past and present. Watson found himself thinking about the nature of knowledge and the ways in which wisdom could transcend the limitations of time and mortality. The voices they had heard speaking through Mrs. Pemberton and the guards represented more than historical information. They were the preserved essence of human experience, the accumulated wisdom of a civilization that had faced its own mortality with courage and foresight. As evening settled over London, painting the city in shades of purple and gold while gas lamps began their nightly illumination of the bustling streets, the museum prepared to close its doors to the public and settle into the quiet contemplation that characterized its nighttime hours. Yet within the Egyptian wing, The artifacts that had briefly awakened to share their ancient secrets returned to their millennial silence with what seemed like satisfied completion. Mrs. Pemberton and the guards departed for their homes, carrying with them the subtle sense of having participated in something significant despite their lack of specific memories. Dr. Blackwood remained to secure his precious notes and begin the process of scholarly analysis that would occupy him for years to come. Holmes and Watson emerged from the museum into the gentle embrace of London's autumn evening, where the fog was beginning to gather once more around the gas lamps, and the familiar sounds of the great city provided a comforting reminder of the solid, rational world that surrounded even the most extraordinary mysteries. "Another case concluded," Watson observed as they walked through the lamplit streets toward the warmth and comfort of Baker Street, their footsteps echoing softly on the wet cobblestones while the fog swirled around them like a welcoming embrace. "Indeed," Holmes replied, his voice carrying the quiet satisfaction of a man whose intellectual curiosity had been thoroughly engaged and ultimately satisfied, though I suspect this particular investigation has raised more questions than it has answered. The relationship between ancient wisdom and modern understanding, between technology and what we term the supernatural, between the preservation of knowledge and the courage to seek truth. These are mysteries that will occupy human minds for generations to come. They walk through the fog-wrapped streets in comfortable silence, each lost in contemplation of the extraordinary events they had witnessed and their implications for understanding the nature of reality itself. Around them, London continued its eternal rhythm of life and commerce, yet they carried with them the knowledge that beneath the surface of the familiar world lay currents of mystery and wonder that connected the present moment to the vast sweep of human experience across the centuries. The gas lamps glowed like warm beacons in the gathering dusk, their amber light creating pools of comfort in the gentle darkness, while the fog transformed the familiar cityscape into something touched by magic and possibility. Somewhere in the distance, Big Ben chimed the hour with its bronze voice, marking the passage of time while the ancient artifacts in the museum prepared to keep their secrets through another long night of dreams and shadow. Back in their sitting room above Baker Street, with the fire crackling warmly in the grate and Mrs. Hudson's tea waiting to provide comfort after their extraordinary day, Holmes and Watson settled into their familiar chairs with the deep satisfaction of men who had ventured into mystery and returned with understanding. The case of the Black Pharaoh's mask had concluded not with the dramatic revelation of criminal conspiracy, but with something far more precious, a glimpse into the eternal human desire to preserve wisdom and share knowledge across the barriers of time and mortality. The fog outside thickened as the night deepened, wrapping London in its protective embrace while within their cosy sanctuary, the two friends sat in companionable silence, each contemplating the remarkable day that had transformed a simple museum consultation into an encounter with the living essence of ancient wisdom. The rain began to fall again, its gentle percussion against the windows creating a lullaby that spoke of peace and completion, of mysteries solved and knowledge preserved for future generations to discover and cherish. In the warmth of the firelight, surrounded by the familiar comforts of their shared life above Baker Street, Holmes reached for his pipe while Watson opened his journal to begin recording their extraordinary adventure. The case would become part of their shared history of investigation and discovery, another chapter in the long story of friendship and intellectual partnership that had carried them through so many mysteries and would sustain them through whatever adventures the future might bring. The ancient voices had returned to their eternal silence, their message delivered, and their trust fulfilled by the careful hands of scholars and investigators who had proven worthy of the knowledge they had worked so hard to preserve. In the darkness outside, London slept peacefully under the protection of fog and lamplight, while within the walls of the British Museum, the artifacts of a vanished civilization rested in satisfied silence, their vigil complete, and their secrets safely entrusted to a new generation of guardians. And in the gentle rhythm of rain against glass, in the soft whisper of coal settling in the grate, in the comfortable silence that surrounded two friends who had shared an encounter with the eternal mysteries of human wisdom and courage, the story found its peaceful conclusion, not with the drama of conflict resolved, but with the deeper satisfaction of understanding achieved and knowledge preserved for the generations yet to come. The fog embraced the city like a blessing, transforming familiar streets into pathways of wonder, while the ancient artifacts slept their millennial sleep, their duty done, and their faith in the future justified by the care and reverence shown by those who had been chosen to receive their precious gift of preserved wisdom and eternal hope. Yet as the night deepened and London settled into its peaceful slumber, a subtle change began to manifest in the museum's Egyptian wing. The artifacts that had briefly awakened to share their ancient knowledge had not returned to complete dormancy, but rather to a state of quiet vigilance, as if they were now actively monitoring the world around them for signs that their wisdom might once again be needed. Dr. Blackwood, who had remained at the museum to secure his notes and reflect upon the day's extraordinary events, became aware of this shift in the early hours before dawn. Walking through the galleries to ensure that everything was properly secured for the night, he noticed that the artifacts seemed somehow more present, more aware than they had appeared during his 30 years of working among them. The hieroglyphic inscriptions on the walls appeared to shimmer slightly in the gaslight, as if the ancient symbols were stirring with renewed life after their long sleep. The stone faces of pharaohs and gods seemed to follow his movements, with eyes that held depths of knowledge and compassion that spoke of consciousness rather than mere carved decoration. Even the air itself felt different, charged with potential, humming softly with energies that his scientific training told him should not exist yet, which his senses could not deny. Holmes and Watson, comfortable in their sitting room above Baker Street, were not yet aware of these developments. The detective sat in his favourite chair, pipe smoke curling around his sharp features as he contemplated the implications of their investigation, while Watson worked steadily at his journal, trying to capture the extraordinary nature of their experience in words that would convey both its factual content and its deeper significance. The rain had intensified, drumming against the windows with a rhythm that seemed almost musical, while the fire in the grate settled into glowing embers that painted dancing shadows on the walls. Outside, the fog had thickened until the familiar streets of their neighbourhood had been transformed into something from a fairy tale, where every gas lamp created a halo of warm light in the grey embrace that wrapped around the city like a protective spell. "Holmes," Watson said softly, looking up from his writing, "do you think this is truly the end of the matter? The manifestation seemed to reach a natural conclusion, but there was something in the final moments that suggested completion rather than termination." His friend considered the question with the careful attention he brought to all matters of investigation, his grey eyes reflecting the firelight as he weighed the various possibilities that Watson's observation had raised. The case had indeed reached what appeared to be a satisfactory resolution, yet Holmes's extensive experience with mysteries masqueraded as simple problems had taught him to remain alert for developments that might extend beyond initial conclusions. "An astute observation, Watson," Holmes replied, his voice carrying the thoughtful tone that indicated his mind was already beginning to consider new possibilities. The ancient system appeared to complete its programmed sequence successfully, yet such sophisticated technology would likely include provisions for ongoing monitoring and potential reactivation if circumstances required it. The implications of this possibility were both fascinating and slightly unsettling. If the artifacts possessed some form of autonomous intelligence, then their brief manifestation might represent not a singular event, but the beginning of an ongoing relationship between the ancient world and the modern one. The question was whether such a relationship would prove beneficial or potentially dangerous to those who found themselves participating in it. Meanwhile, back at the museum, Dr. Blackwood had discovered that his ability to read ancient Egyptian had not disappeared with the conclusion of the manifestation. As he examined the hieroglyphic inscriptions that decorated the gallery walls, he found that he could understand them with a fluency that surpassed anything he had achieved through decades of scholarly study. The knowledge that had flowed through him during Mrs. Pemberton's trance state had apparently left permanent traces, enhancing his natural abilities in ways that transformed his relationship with the ancient texts. The discovery was simultaneously thrilling and bewildering. On one hand, It represented the fulfillment of every Egyptologist's dream, perfect comprehension of the ancient language in all its subtle nuances and cultural implications. On the other hand, it raised profound questions about the nature of consciousness and memory, about the ways in which knowledge could be transmitted directly from mind to mind, across the barriers of time and death. As Blackwood moved through the galleries, reading inscriptions with newfound understanding, he began to perceive patterns and connections that had previously been invisible to him. The artifacts were not randomly collected treasures, but components of a vast, interconnected system designed to preserve and transmit knowledge across the millennia. Each piece contained specific information that complemented and enhanced the others, creating a comprehensive library of ancient wisdom that could only be fully accessed when all the components were brought together in proper alignment. The Black Pharaoh's mask, he realized, had served as the activation key for this system, its unique crystalline structure providing the resonance patterns necessary to awaken the dormant information storage capabilities of the other artifacts. The manifestation they had witnessed was not supernatural intervention, but the operation of technology so advanced that it seemed like magic to minds accustomed to more primitive methods of information preservation. This understanding brought with it a sense of tremendous responsibility. If the museum's Egyptian collection contained a functioning repository of ancient knowledge, then its preservation and proper study became a matter of paramount importance not just for archaeological scholarship, but for human understanding of the relationship between technology and consciousness, between past and present, between the accumulated wisdom of vanished civilizations and the challenges facing the modern world. Holmes, meanwhile, had risen from his chair and moved to the window, where he stood looking out at the fog-wrapped streets of London with the contemplative air of a man whose mind was working through complex theoretical problems. The gaslight below created pools of warm illumination in the grey embrace that surrounded the city, while the gentle percussion of rain against glass provided a soothing counterpoint to his thoughts. "Watson," he said suddenly, his voice carrying the sharp note of insight that his friend had learned to recognise as the moment when seemingly unrelated facts began forming coherent patterns in the detective's remarkable mind. "I believe we may have underestimated the scope of what we witnessed today. If the mask and its companion artifacts represent components of an ancient information storage system, then similar systems may exist in museums and private collections around the world. The implications of this possibility were staggering. If multiple repositories of ancient knowledge existed in dormant states, waiting for the proper conditions to activate and share their preserved wisdom, then humanity might be on the verge of a revolution in understanding that would dwarf the achievements of the Renaissance or the Enlightenment." Watson set aside his journal and joined his friend at the window, both men gazing out at the transformed cityscape where familiar buildings had become mysterious silhouettes in the gentle embrace of fog and lamplight. The night seemed pregnant with possibility, as if the very air hummed with potential for discovery and revelation. "How might we identify such systems?" Watson asked, his practical mind already considering the investigative approaches that might be needed to locate and study other repositories of ancient technology. "Pattern recognition," Holmes replied, his voice taking on the instructional tone he used when developing complex theoretical frameworks. "Museums that have reported unexplained phenomena around Egyptian artifacts, private collectors who have experienced unusual events after acquiring specific pieces, archaeological sites where excavations have been accompanied by anomalous occurrences that were dismissed as coincidence or imagination." The prospect of conducting a systematic investigation into such phenomena appealed to both men, representing the kind of scholarly detective work that combined their respective areas of expertise. Holmes's analytical abilities and Watson's medical knowledge, combined with their shared experience of the extraordinary events at the British Museum, uniquely qualified them to recognise and study manifestations that others might dismiss as supernatural nonsense or explained away through conventional rationalisation. Back at the museum, Dr. Blackwood had made another discovery that would profoundly impact their understanding of the ancient system. Hidden within the hieroglyphic inscriptions that he could now read with perfect comprehension were detailed instructions for the proper care and activation of the artifact network. The ancient Egyptians had anticipated that their technology might eventually be discovered by future civilizations and had embedded comprehensive operating manuals within the decorative elements of their storage devices. According to these instructions, the system was designed to activate automatically when certain conditions were met. Specifically, when multiple components were brought together in the presence of individuals whose mental and spiritual development had reached levels that the ancient guardians considered appropriate for receiving their preserved wisdom. The manifestation they had witnessed was essentially the system's method of evaluating and approving the contemporary guardians who would be responsible for its continued preservation and study. The evaluation had apparently been successful, as evidenced by the permanent enhancement of Blackwood's linguistic abilities and the peaceful conclusion of the activation sequence. The artifacts had essentially granted him and his colleagues custodial status over the repository, along with the knowledge necessary to properly maintain and access its contents. This revelation brought with it both tremendous privilege and equally tremendous responsibility. The ancient guardians had entrusted them with knowledge that represented the accumulated wisdom of an entire civilization, but they had also placed upon them the obligation to ensure that such knowledge was used wisely and for the benefit of humanity as a whole. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the museum's windows, painting the ancient artifacts in shades of rose and gold that seemed to bring them alive with remembered warmth, Blackwood completed his initial survey of the newly comprehensible inscriptions. The information he'd gathered represented just the beginning of what promised to be years or even decades of study, yet already the implications were profound enough to reshape understanding of ancient Egyptian civilization and its relationship to the development of human consciousness. Holmes and Watson had remained at their window through the night, their minds engaged in the kind of deep philosophical discussion that their most extraordinary cases often inspired. As the fog began to lift with the coming of morning, revealing the familiar landmarks of their neighbourhood, emerging like islands from a receding grey sea, they could sense that their investigation had opened doors to realms of knowledge and possibility that would influence the rest of their lives. The case of the Black Pharaoh's mask had concluded, but in its conclusion lay the seeds of future adventures that would take them far beyond the comfortable boundaries of criminal investigation, into territories where science and wisdom, past and present, technology and consciousness intersected in ways that challenged every assumption about the nature of reality itself. Mrs. Hudson appeared with their morning tea, her kind face glowing with the satisfaction of a woman who took pride in caring for her unusual tenants. As she bustled about the room, adjusting curtains and straightening papers with unconscious efficiency, both men felt a profound appreciation for the simple, reliable comforts that anchored them to the everyday world even as their minds explored the extraordinary possibilities that lay beyond conventional understanding. The morning light streaming through their windows carried the promise of a new day filled with potential for discovery and revelation. Outside, London was awakening to its familiar rhythms of commerce and conversation, yet beneath the surface of routine activities lay currents of mystery and wonder that connected the bustling Victorian metropolis to the vast sweep of human achievement across the centuries. Dr. Blackwood arrived at Baker Street just as the city clocks were chiming 9, his face showing the excitement and exhaustion of a man who had spent the night in profound communion with knowledge that transcended the normal boundaries of scholarly research. He carried with him a portfolio of transcriptions and observations that represented the first systematic documentation of the ancient information system's operating principles. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying the controlled enthusiasm of a scholar who had made discoveries that would reshape his entire field of study, "I believe we have only begun to understand the significance of what occurred yesterday. The artifacts have revealed operating instructions that suggest their capabilities extend far beyond simple information storage into realms that challenge our fundamental assumptions about the relationship between consciousness and technology." Holmes received this news with the sharp attention he brought to all significant developments, while Watson prepared tea for their visitor with the automatic hospitality that characterized their shared life above Baker Street. The morning light painted their sitting room in shades of gold and amber that seemed to celebrate the beginning of a new chapter, in their ongoing exploration of the world's hidden mysteries. As Blackwood spread his transcriptions across the table, revealing hieroglyphic texts that he could now read with perfect fluency, the scope of the ancient achievement became increasingly clear. The Egyptian repository was not merely a technological marvel, but a spiritual and philosophical system that integrated advanced understanding of consciousness, energy, and information in ways that modern science was only beginning to approach. According to these instructions, Blackwood explained, his finger tracing the elegant hieroglyphic symbols that had revealed their secrets during his night of discovery, the system is designed not just to preserve knowledge, but to facilitate the continuing evolution of human consciousness. Each activation creates the potential for expanded awareness and enhanced cognitive abilities in those who prove worthy of such enhancement. The implications were profound, suggesting that humanity's encounter with ancient wisdom might catalyze developments in consciousness and understanding that could transform the entire trajectory of human civilization. Yet such possibilities also carried corresponding responsibilities, as the enhanced abilities came with the obligation to use them wisely, and for the benefit of all humanity. Holmes studied the transcriptions with the comprehensive attention he brought to all important evidence, his mind already beginning to analyse the patterns and principles that the ancient system embodied. Watson found himself thinking about the medical implications of consciousness enhancement, wondering what physiological changes might accompany the psychological transformations that Blackwood had experienced. "The question now," Holmes said finally, his voice carrying the thoughtful tone that indicated his mind was working through complex theoretical problems, "is how we proceed with this knowledge." Clearly the ancient guardians intended their system to influence the continuing development of human understanding, but they also built in safeguards to ensure that such influence would be beneficial rather than destructive. The afternoon passed in detailed discussion of the various approaches they might take to studying and developing the implications of their discovery. The ancient repository represented a treasure trove of knowledge that could advance human understanding in dozens of different fields, yet accessing that knowledge would require careful, methodical work that respected both the sophistication of the original system and the responsibilities that came with custodial status over such precious information. As evening approached, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold while gas lamps began their nightly illumination of London's bustling streets, the three men had developed the outline of a research program that would occupy them for years to come. The investigation that had begun as a simple consultation about mysterious disturbances at a museum had evolved into something far more significant, a systematic exploration of the relationship between ancient wisdom and modern understanding that promised to reshape human knowledge of consciousness, technology, and the vast continuity of civilization across the millennia. Dr. Blackwood departed for the museum with a sense of profound purpose, carrying with him the knowledge that his life's work had taken on dimensions that he could never have imagined during his decades of conventional archaeological research. The artefacts in his care were no longer simply museum pieces, but active participants in an ongoing dialogue between past and present that would influence the future development of human consciousness. Holmes and Watson remained in their sitting room as the night deepened around them, each lost in contemplation of the extraordinary journey that had carried them from a simple letter requesting investigation into realms where the boundaries between science and wisdom, technology and consciousness dissolved into unified understanding of humanity's place in the vast sweep of cosmic development. The fog began to gather once more around the gas lamps, transforming London into a city of soft edges and mysterious distances where every shadow might conceal a story and every pool of lamplight might mark the beginning of an adventure. Yet within their comfortable sanctuary above Baker Street, surrounded by the familiar objects of their shared life and warmed by the gentle glow of coal fire and friendship, they felt the deep satisfaction of men who had contributed to the advancement of human knowledge while remaining true to the principles of careful investigation and scholarly integrity that had guided all their finest work. The ancient voices had shared their wisdom and returned to their eternal silence, their message delivered and their trust fulfilled by the careful hands of those who had proven worthy of the knowledge they had worked so hard to preserve. In the darkness outside, London slept peacefully under the protection of fog and lamplight, while within the walls of the British Museum, the artefacts of a vanished civilization maintained their quiet vigil, ready to share their secrets with future generations who would approach them with the proper combination of knowledge, respect, and genuine desire to understand the deeper mysteries of human existence. The case was concluded, yet its conclusion marked not an ending but a beginning. The start of a new chapter in the long story of human discovery that would carry the wisdom of the past into an uncertain but promising future. And in the gentle rhythm of rain against glass, in the soft whisper of coal settling in the grate, in the comfortable silence that surrounded two friends who had shared an encounter with the eternal mysteries of human achievement and aspiration, the story found its perfect resolution in the knowledge that some treasures are too precious to be lost, and that the human spirit's quest for understanding transcends all boundaries of time and mortality. As the weeks passed following their extraordinary encounter with the Black Pharaoh's mask, the effects of that transformative experience continued to ripple outward through the lives of all who had participated in the ancient awakening. Dr. Blackwood found that his enhanced understanding of hieroglyphic texts had opened doorways to knowledge that transformed not only his scholarly work, but his entire perception of the relationship between ancient and modern consciousness. Each morning, as he entered the museum's Egyptian wing, the artifacts seemed to welcome him with a subtle warmth that spoke of recognition and approval. The hieroglyphic inscriptions that had once required painstaking translation now revealed their meanings as naturally as reading English, while the deeper symbolic layers of meaning unfolded in his consciousness like flowers blooming in morning sunlight. Holmes and Watson maintained regular contact with the curator, meeting weekly in the museum's quiet reading room to discuss the ongoing implications of their discovery. These gatherings had taken on the quality of informal seminars, where ancient wisdom and modern analytical methods combined to produce insights that none of them could have achieved working alone. On one particularly foggy November evening, as autumn deepened into the embrace of approaching winter, Holmes sat in his favourite chair contemplating a letter that had arrived that morning from Professor Whitmore. The scholar had finally awakened from his mysterious sleep, but rather than returning to his former state, he had emerged with abilities that paralleled those granted to Dr. Blackwood, perfect comprehension of ancient Egyptian in all its subtle variations, along with intuitive understanding of the cultural and spiritual contexts that gave the language its deeper meaning. Mrs. Pemberton had experienced similar enhancements, though hers manifested differently. Her work with the museum's manuscript collection had been revolutionized by an uncanny ability to detect connections and patterns across different historical periods and cultural traditions. Ancient texts that had seemed unrelated now revealed themselves as parts of larger narratives that spanned centuries and continents, suggesting that the Egyptian repository was just one component of a global network of knowledge preservation systems. Watson looked up from his medical journal, where he had been documenting the physiological aspects of consciousness enhancement that they had observed in their museum colleagues. His physician's training had provided unique insights into the biological mechanisms that might underlie such profound cognitive changes, though the phenomena clearly operated according to principles that extended far beyond current medical understanding. "The reports continue to arrive," Holmes murmured, his grey eyes reflecting the firelight as he studied the latest correspondence from scholars and investigators around the world. Similar manifestations at the Cairo Museum, unusual phenomena at the Louvre's Egyptian collection, unexplained events at private estates housing significant archaeological acquisitions. The pattern was becoming unmistakable. Ancient repositories of knowledge were awakening from their millennial dormancy, responding to some cosmic timing that the original guardians had built into their preservation systems. The activation at the British Museum had apparently triggered a global resonance that was bringing dormant technologies back to life across multiple continents. Mrs. Hudson appeared with their evening tea, her presence bringing the comfortable domesticity that anchored their extraordinary investigations to the solid foundations of everyday life. As she arranged the china on their table with practiced efficiency, Both men felt profound gratitude for the simple, reliable rhythms that provided stability amid the vast mysteries they had chosen to explore. The fog outside had thickened until the familiar streets of London had been transformed into something from a fairy tale, where gas lamps created halos of warm light in the grey embrace that wrapped around the city like a protective spell. The sounds of the great metropolis, the clip-clop of horses, the distant rumble of late omnibuses, the soft conversation of evening pedestrians, all became muffled and dreamlike, as if the fog were not merely a meteorological phenomenon, but a gateway between the rational world of gaslight and industry and the older, deeper realm of mystery and wonder. Holmes rose from his chair and moved to the window, where he stood looking out at the transformed cityscape, with the contemplative air of a man whose mind was engaged with questions that extended far beyond the immediate circumstances of any single investigation. The lamplight below painted shifting patterns in the mist, while somewhere in the distance Big Ben chimed the quarter hour with its bronze voice rolling across the sleeping city like a lullaby. "Watson," he said finally, his voice carrying the thoughtful tone that indicated profound consideration of complex possibilities, "I believe we are witnessing the beginning of a new era in human development. The ancient guardians who created these knowledge repositories understood something about the nature of consciousness and its relationship to cosmic cycles that we are only beginning to appreciate." The implications were staggering to contemplate. If the awakening of ancient repositories represented part of some larger pattern of human development, then their investigation had inadvertently become participation in an evolutionary process that spanned millennia. The enhanced abilities manifesting in their colleagues might be harbingers of broader changes in human consciousness that would reshape civilization itself. Watson joined his friend at the window, both men gazing out at the fog-wrapped streets where familiar buildings had become mysterious silhouettes in the gentle embrace of mist and lamplight. The night seemed pregnant with possibility, as if the very air hummed with potential for discovery and transformation that transcended the boundaries of individual investigation. "The responsibility is enormous," Watson observed, his voice soft with the weight of understanding that had grown from their weeks of studying the ancient system's implications. "If we have indeed been chosen as guardians of knowledge that could transform human understanding, then every decision we make carries consequences that extend far beyond our own lives." Holmes nodded, his sharp profile silhouetted against the window as he considered the various paths that lay before them. The ancient repositories were clearly designed to facilitate the continuing evolution of human consciousness, but they were also built with safeguards to ensure that such evolution proceeded wisely and for the benefit of all humanity, rather than the aggrandizement of individuals or groups. The weeks of study had revealed that the Egyptian system included sophisticated methods for evaluating the worthiness of those who encountered it. The peaceful conclusion of their initial manifestation indicated that they had passed whatever tests the ancient guardians had embedded in their technology, but ongoing access to the system's deeper capabilities would require continued demonstration of wisdom, integrity, and genuine commitment to the advancement of human understanding. Dr. Blackwood had discovered additional layers of instruction hidden within the hieroglyphic texts, revealing protocols for the gradual activation of more advanced capabilities, as the contemporary guardians proved their readiness for greater responsibilities. The ancient Egyptians had apparently anticipated that the rediscovery of their knowledge would occur during a period of rapid technological and social change, and they had designed their systems to provide guidance for navigating such transitions successfully. The fire in the grate settled with a soft whisper, sending up small showers of golden sparks that danced briefly in the warm air before fading into nothing. The light painted shifting patterns on the walls, while the familiar objects of their sitting room, books and instruments, papers and pipes, took on an almost magical quality in the gentle glow that spoke of comfort and continuity amid the vast mysteries that surrounded human existence. Holmes returned to his chair and reached for his pipe, filling it with the deliberate care of a ritual performed countless times before. The tobacco glowed as he applied a match, releasing its familiar fragrance into the air, where it mingled with the scent of coal smoke and the lingering traces of Mrs. Hudson's excellent tea. The correspondent suggests that similar awakenings are occurring with increasing frequency, he said, his words emerging with small puffs of aromatic smoke. Museums in Berlin, Rome, and St. Petersburg report phenomena that closely parallel our own experience. Private collectors across Europe and America describe manifestations that began shortly after our encounter with the mask. The global scope of the awakening suggested that they were indeed witnessing the activation of a worldwide network of knowledge repositories, each designed to contribute specific elements to a comprehensive system of consciousness enhancement and wisdom preservation. The ancient guardians had apparently created redundant systems across multiple civilizations, ensuring that their knowledge would survive even the complete collapse of any single culture or geographic region. Watson settled back into his own chair, feeling the comfortable weight of exhaustion that came from days filled with extraordinary discovery and profound contemplation. The investigation that had begun with a simple consultation about mysterious disturbances had evolved into something that challenged every assumption about the nature of reality, consciousness, and humanity's place in the vast cosmos. "What do you think the ancients ultimately intended?" Watson asked, his voice carrying the philosophical tone that their most extraordinary cases often inspired. What was the final purpose of preserving all this knowledge across such vast spans of time? Holmes was quiet for a long moment, his sharp grey eyes reflecting the firelight as he considered questions that touched the very foundations of human existence and purpose. When he spoke, his voice carried the measured cadence of a man who had learned to approach the deepest mysteries with both intellectual rigour and genuine humility. "I believe," he said finally, "that they understood something about the cyclical nature of consciousness development that we are only beginning to perceive. Human civilization appears to go through periods of expansion and contraction, of knowledge gained and knowledge lost, of spiritual advancement and material focus. The repositories were designed to provide guidance and enhancement during the transition periods, when humanity is ready to integrate ancient wisdom with contemporary understanding." The elegant simplicity of this explanation provided a framework for understanding not only their specific experience, but the broader patterns of human development across history. The great civilizations of the past, Egyptian, Greek, Roman, Mayan, had all achieved levels of understanding that seemed to exceed what their technology should have made possible, suggesting that they too had access to enhancement systems that facilitated accelerated consciousness development. The rain had resumed its gentle percussion against the windows, creating the soothing rhythm that had become the soundtrack for their most profound conversations. Outside, London continued its eternal cycle of activity and rest. Yet within their cosy sanctuary above Baker Street, time seemed to flow according to different rules that connected each moment to the vast sweep of human achievement and aspiration across the centuries. Mrs. Hudson could be heard moving about in the kitchen below, her soft footsteps and the gentle clink of china creating a domestic melody that spoke of safety and routine, of a world where mysteries might be contemplated in comfort and wisdom might be pursued without fear. These sounds provided a comforting counterpoint to the vast implications of their discoveries, anchoring their extraordinary investigations to the solid foundations of everyday human life. As the night deepened and the fog thickened around the gas lamps, transforming their familiar neighbourhood into something touched by magic and possibility, Holmes and Watson sat in the companionable silence that characterised their deepest friendship. Each man was lost in his own contemplation of the remarkable journey that had carried them from a simple consultation about museum disturbances into realms where ancient wisdom and modern understanding converged in ways that promised to reshape human civilization itself. The ancient voices had shared their knowledge and returned to their eternal vigilance, their message delivered and their trust placed in the careful hands of those who had proven worthy of such precious gifts. Yet their influence continued to ripple outward through the lives of all who had encountered them, creating possibilities for growth and understanding that would extend far beyond any single generation or cultural tradition. The case of the Black Pharaoh's mask had concluded, but its conclusion had opened doorways to adventures that would occupy the rest of their lives and influence the continuing development of human consciousness for generations to come. In the gentle glow of firelight and friendship, surrounded by the comfortable evidence of their shared dedication to truth and understanding, they had found something more precious than the solution to any single mystery. They discovered their place in the eternal human quest for wisdom that transcends all boundaries of time, culture, and mortality. The fog embraced London like a blessing, while ancient knowledge slept peacefully in its modern guardian's care, and two friends sat in grateful contemplation of the extraordinary privilege that had been granted them, the opportunity to serve as bridges between the wisdom of the past and the promise of an enlightened future that stretched ahead like a pathway illuminated by the eternal light of human curiosity and courage. And with that, tonight's tale slips into the dark. But before you drift away, tell us, are you listening from the snowy nights of Moscow, the golden haze of Cairo, the bustling quiet of Toronto, or the deep silence of Reykjavik? Like, share, and subscribe if these stories stir your soul. Until we return, rest well and let the night keep your secrets.